Hi, everybody. So I hope everyone is doing well. Can everybody see and hear me okay? Let's all wave if you're all good. Hi, Paul. I saw Tracy Ehlers is on. I just got an email from Nikki that you wanted to join. So I'm so glad we have some new people today. Some people I can't see, but I'm glad to have a nice group here to talk about some of the most original movies in the Jewish area that I've seen. And I wanted to explain a little bit why I thought of doing it this way as opposed to just the best movies. Often the movies that are considered the best are the ones that are the most masterful, the ones that we like to consider really brilliantly crafted and well made, and tackle a subject that's important and do so with great skill. And that's about as good as it gets in terms of cinema. But there's a category of film that sometimes I think gets overlooked, and those films are extremely original, creative, unusual. They're often films that aren't successful initially, but in hindsight have become classics. And I'm hoping that we can foster a little more appreciation today for some movies that maybe require a little more adventurous spirit, a little bit more uh, uh, reflection and patience, etc. And so I'm hoping to cast some light on some movies that maybe some of them you've seen and maybe some of them you haven't, but hopefully we'll be able to recommend some movies that you can either see again or see for the first time. And what do I mean by an original film? I can tell you that when I was a film critic at the camera, and the hardest thing about being a critic really was the feeling that I was writing the same review over and over and over again, because I was reviewing the same movie over and over and over again. And it wasn't just because it was a sequel or because it was a Hollywood derivative kind of B movie. Even very good movies, I'd seen that story 100 times. I knew the cliches, I knew the conventions, I could see what was coming. And so when I would see a movie that really surprised me, that really I could walk out and say, I haven't seen that movie before, that got my attention, and that earned a lot of respect. And I also found that I'd be more forgiving of a film that had great ambitions as opposed to a movie that was just really well made. And there's nothing wrong with either one, and I want to make that very clear. Art has lots of purposes, and but one of them certainly should be to surprise us and to push the boundaries, to push the envelope. Um, in terms of what I mean by original films, it might be a lot of the films that I like and that we'll be talking about today are dark films, because dark is not really what tends to sell. Light is what tends to sell. Entertaining, life-affirming, joyful, insightful, those things sell, but dark can be a hard sell. Outrageous films that just really are too outrageous for our tastes or what we're used to, can also be kind of off-putting. Sometimes films operate in more of a dreamscape reality. That can make it a very unusual kind of experience. Often, though, we're talking about stylized aesthetics, in other words, something very, new. If you think about Citizen Kane, all of a sudden you have three planes, the close-up, the mid-level, and then way in the back you can see someone in a doorway who's also in focus, and all three planes are in focus. That was a brand new thing that Orson Welles did, and he was obviously a very creative genius, and putting ceilings in and filming from below. So you got the sense that people were in real rooms, not in sound stages. So very often it's stylization, it's the visuals of a film that make it really original or unusual. Sometimes it's the perspective. It could be a female perspective in a male story. The female perspective often is a very unusual a kind of perspective. Sometimes a narrator will be an unusual narrator, and that will make it really something different from what you've heard or seen before. Often the use of humor can make something very controversial, something that's very serious but is treated with humor, which we're going to be talking about quite a bit today, is another thing that can be very off-putting to some people or make people uncomfortable. And we'll be talking later about the role of being discomfited by films as well as the purpose of art to comfort us. And also content. This could just be a subject that really is not dealt with. And when we talk about To Dust, people just don't talk about, when they have to bury someone and death and dying, that sometimes it's just the topic itself as well as how it's treated that really makes something unusual. I want to talk, before I start talking about some of the specific films, I want to backtrack a little bit with some history. And put this in a little bit more context. Film is a collaborative art form. Other art forms are not collaborative, and in those art forms, originality is highly, highly prized. If you think of, let's just start with a story, which is usually literature before we had film, before we had a camera, but that's really what film generally is. It's storytelling in the same way literature of all kinds is. And if you go back to the original, literature, and you talk about myth, we totally understand that these are very original stories that have a creator. These are stories that are made up from imagination. When we hear about Greek gods or myths and monsters and all the kinds of ancient storytelling, we know that they were very, very richly imagined, and they weren't just Joe woke up in the morning and went out and killed a woolly mammoth. So from the very beginning, literature has been very much based in myth and also in fantasy. And we understand metaphor in literature very, very well. I always like to think about Kafka and the opening line of Metamorphosis. One morning, Gregor Samsa awoke from uneasy dreams to find he had been changed in his bed to a monstrous vermin. That has yet to be made into a movie. And I will tell you, it probably will never be made into a movie because it's something literature can do very well. Film is much more literal because you see it. We are left to wonder what Gregor Samsa, what this vermin is going to look like, feel like, what it is. It's not an insect, by the way. It's not a bug. It's often mistranslated. It's just vermin. And so our imagination fills in what he looks like. In film, we have to choose. He has to be a cockroach. He has to be something that is very specific. Even in the Marvel universe, which plays on the kind of mythology that was popular throughout the centuries, and in sci-fi also, you get an awful lot of creativity, fantasy, imagination. We understand that when we're in Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or any of those kinds of films, we understand this is an imagined universe that's created for us. And film is really quite good, especially since the advent of special effects and et cetera, in helping to open up our imagination to these different kinds of worlds the same way that literature is able to. And yet it's a much more literal kind of art form than literature has tended to be. In painting, you certainly it only takes one person to paint. It's not a collaborative art form. Two people could paint together. It's really, you know, you look at a painting because you're interested in the artist. You aren't so much that's why you look at paintings. That's why the artist is more famous than the paintings themselves, because that artist is, it's their originality, it's their creativity. Now, representationalism was the norm in how well you could represent reality for a painter. Was, you know, through the old masters period, that was the thing. But even then you had someone like El Greco, who elongated figures and tried to suggest that there was something more about how you perceive reality, as opposed to just depicting reality as accurately as possible. Then, of course, starting with Impressionism, artists started to give us an impression of reality that didn't look exactly like it, but certainly was an impression. And then the Expressionists came along and said, I'm going to tell you how I feel about reality. I'm going to express what reality feels like in, you know, to me. And that artist's vision of that is what we look for in a Picasso or any artist, starting with, you know, Monet's showing you what water lilies look like to him, you know, Warhol, all artists, they have a style, they're distinctive, and they're obviously showing you a version of their version of reality. That isn't always the same in film. It really, artists are not as prized for their originality and vision in film as they have been in other art forms like literature and painting. And it's largely because it is such a collaborative art form versus a single artist, the product of a single artist. It carries with it elements of painting. These are moving paintings. Every frame is a framed image that then translates to a next image that's exactly on the same principles as any kind of painting, you know, or drawing. It obviously has literature because it has text, it has story, it has characters, it has dialogue. It has music, it has costumes, it has set, it has lighting, it has all kinds of artists have to collaborate to make a film. And I have a fond memory of the early 80s having a conversation with Roger Ebert, who was always very, very kind to me as the local critic. And I would talk to him every year during the conference, and I would write something about him. And the question he was always being asked was, why are movies so bad? Why aren't there more good movies? I mean, a critic goes to hundreds, couple of 200-300 movies a year. And if you can say 20 or 30 of them were really worth your while, you know, that's saying something. Why? And he got a little tired of being asked that question. And he said, look, when you consider someone has to come up with a great story, then the right director has to come along that really understands that story. That director has to have the right resources to be able to tell that story. He has to rely on a cast, the right actors who also understand the vision of the story. The set designer, the costume designer, the cinematography, everyone involved has to buy into that same vision, be on that same page for the movie to really be successful. And when you figure that, Roger Ebert said, it's amazing there are any good movies. I mean, it's amazing that any good movies get made at all when you consider how many things have to align, as opposed to one person with a brush or a musician with an instrument or just, you know, singing alone. It's so collaborative that it makes it challenging, and it certainly makes creativity, originality that much more challenging, because it's hard enough for the single vision to get everyone else on board, never mind if that single vision is very distinctive and unusual. So often you find the most creative work gets done in unusual situations, like somebody who's the writer, director, producer, you know, doing all those roles. The Coen brothers are a great example. There's two of them and they have the same brain, you know, so they've really been able to, you know, and we'll talk about them shortly. So it's really a challenge to find the right situation in which sometimes it's a first film, a filmmaker who just has something in their head that's totally different than anything else, and it comes out, and we'll talk about some of those in a minute as well. But in general, the art form mediates against creativity. It's just sort of how it's always been. Now, historically, in the early days of cinema, there was a lot of creativity, and certainly the early practitioners, many of them were artists and liaisons and people like that, were off trying to really do creative things with film. But as it became an industry and settled into the studio system, it really became a business. It was certainly an art form, and I wouldn't argue that it's not an art form, but it certainly was mediated by commercial concerns. And even though you got creative films like Wizard of Oz or whatever, the studio system really mediated against any kind of wild creativity. But in the 50s, you did start to get foreign filmmakers, Fellini, Bergman, Antonioni, people like that, who Kurosawa, who start to have a great influence on filmmakers. And you see, for instance, Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, and then it gets translated into The Magnificent Seven. There's a very direct correlation between the European sensibilities, in which the auteur theory starts to emerge. And the auteur theory was that there are directors who are visionary, singular artists who you can always recognize their film by their distinctive style, or you can always understand their concerns, because the same way you can always recognize a Picasso, you can always recognize a Bergman film. And my favorite joke about Bergman is that all of Bergman's films could have the same title, which is Sven and His Incurable Depression. So, but when we think about Bergman, we don't think about his stories. The same with Fellini. We don't think about, the story about, what we think about is the elephants on the beach. We think about, death on the beach. We think about visual images. We think about things that just so surprised us that we didn't expect. Those filmmakers really had a huge impulse to be creative, and that informed the rest of cinema as well, so that in the 60s we started to get movies like Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, Five Easy Pieces, Easy Rider, Midnight Cowboy, Harold and Maude, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And what's interesting about all of these titles is they all have one thing in common. They all have an anti-hero. None of them, they all subvert the hero genre, in which, the good guys win and everybody lives happily ever after. And the bad, if it's a crime movie like Bonnie and Clyde, well, they deserve to die because they're, criminals. But in this case, they become sympathetic. So they're sort of the anti-hero gets, and, The Graduate, he's Dustin Hoffman is certainly an anti-hero. Jack Nicholson, The Easy Rider, The Midnight Cowboy, which inverts the buddy movie when you think of how dark that kind of a buddy movie became. Harold and Maude, which a romantic comedy. I mean, how dark was that? And she's, of course, a Holocaust survivor. Cuckoo's Nest, again, the Jack Nicholson and the anti-hero. So we get a lot of originality bursting out of the 60s. Some of it's stylistic. It's a Godard, cinema verite. Suddenly things are much more naturalistic. They're more like they really are in real life. So there's an acting style that changes. We get into the period of method acting, much more naturalistic, and a lot of inversion of popular genres. Of course, we get Kubrick in 2001: A Space Odyssey, which inverts the sci-fi and space travel conventions. Robert Altman with things like Nashville, which really just blew the musical genre wide open. Francis Ford Coppola in Apocalypse Now, totally something you hadn't seen before. Woody Allen was also an incredible original with Annie Hall, Crimes and Misdemeanors, both of which I highly recommend as among the best of 20th century Jewish film. Quentin Tarantino comes along, and again with stylized violence, revenge fantasy, but starting with Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, and Glorious Bastards. He, again, totally is a creative person. You know his films, and they may not be to everyone's taste, but you absolutely understand that you're seeing something that is his and his alone. Wes Anderson is another filmmaker that I would point to more recent years, making very original work that is definitely auteur work. If you see Grand Budapest Hotel, you know it's totally different than any other director working today. And even someone like Scorsese, who is more of a workman-like filmmaker who loves genre, he's also had some very creative work. After Hours was his sort of nightmare dream film that I still think is one of the best evocations of what it's like to have a long nightmare. So that's a little bit of what brings us to the current cinema. And I'm really going to be talking about movies from the last 20 years or so, maybe a little bit farther back, but I wanted to give you a little bit of background in terms of originality. And I want to start with the Coen brothers, and I'll tell you my anecdote, which is in the mid 80s, around 85, Blood Simple came out, I think it was probably 84. Blood Simple played at the Denver International Film Festival. It was one of the premieres, and I was the film critic at the camera at the time. And so afterwards, I happened to go out for a couple of beers with the program director and I and Joel Coen and Ethan Coen. And they had just had this first film, Blood Simple. We sat down in a booth, we chatted, we had a very nice time. They struck me as incredible, smart, nerdy, young guys who were, you know, just having a great time with their first film. But I was blown away by Blood Simple. And if you have not seen Blood Simple and you like the Coen brothers, I would start there because it is really an incredible movie that breaks a lot of conventions and traditions and establishes them as the kind of stylists that they would go on to be. They grew up in Minnesota, as probably many of you know, and they have said when asked, this is a direct quote from Joel, "There's no doubt our Jewish heritage affects how we see things," they've said, and I think that's absolutely true. There's a very kind of subversion again. There's something very subversive about the Coen brothers films. There's a lot of parody, again, this use of humor and darkness. There is not a drop of sentimentality anywhere in any of their films. They're the most unsentimental films possible. So they're kind of the anti-Hollywood film, I always sort of think. They're very formal in speech often, which reminds me of David Mamet, who also uses sort of more formalized speech. And I also recommend David Mamet very highly as a Jewish sounding author. If you haven't seen one of their most recent films, The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, which is on Netflix, there's one it's an episodic. There's 6 short films. One of them is one of the hardest films I think I've ever watched. If anybody's seen it, there's one that's just incredibly devastating. But they're all brilliant. They are all incredibly brilliant and cleverly written and completely surprising. Each and every one of them ends with complete surprise. So I do recommend. And the very first one stars Tim Blake Nelson, who is one of my favorite Jewish actors. Tim Blake Nelson we'll be talking about in reference to The Gray Zone later because he directed that. He's a Jewish actor. Zoe Kazan is also in Ballad of Buster Scruggs, and she's in The Plot Against America right now. She's wonderful. She's the daughter of the granddaughter of Elia Kazan. Barton Fink is one of their most Jewish movies. If you haven't seen Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, or No Country for Old Men, or Fargo, The Coen brothers are really not to be missed, and I would have to sort of put them at the top of original Jewish films and filmmakers. The next film I wanted to talk about, there are actually two films in a row that I showed at the film festival that I think are probably the two most original films I've shown. The first one is To Dust. How many people saw To Dust? Raise your hand if you saw To Dust. Okay, a few of you saw it. It is, all of the films I'm talking about are available on Amazon and some on Netflix as well. So To Dust was the first film by Sean Snyder, who was a delightful young Jewish guy. And I think it had something to do with the fact that it was his first film. And so he somehow felt free to create something that I've absolutely never seen before. I just this morning listened to an interview that he did a couple of years ago with Matthew Broderick on one of the shows, and he says he describes it as, quote, Hasidic Borscht Belt scientific horror buddy dramedy about grief. And that's really what it is. It is about the search for meaning. It is about an interior life. It is about the absurdity of the human condition is really, that's something else that kind of came up. And you don't get too many films that really are successful in touching on the absurdity of the human condition. But To Dust really is. The best review that I read of To Dust had a line that I thought was so brilliant, I really wish I had written it. It said that To Dust was about a man trying to get to the other side of grief with his faith intact. And I think that is an exact description of what this story is. We don't like to talk about what happens to your body after you die. We don't like to talk about what we think about when our loved ones are rotting in the ground and how we might feel. And we don't, but we all understand that grief is a mysterious landscape that we enter and wander until we emerge somewhere else. And that's what this movie is about. So it is an incredibly ambitious film, and I thought it was hilarious. It's outrageous. It's certainly full of chutzpah, full of this idea that jokes with an Orthodox guy and pigs is a huge part of the humor. And a number of reviews used words like queasy or cringe-worthy moments, like, you see a rotting pig or something. This is not a film that is supposed to comfort you. It's about how hard it is to find comfort in grief. And these two men go on try to solve a mystery together. And it is one of the most important mysteries of human life. So, as well as a very scientific one about how a body rots. And it to me was everything that I look for, especially in a young filmmaker, that tells me there's more films going to come from this imagination that are going to be exciting and different. So if you haven't seen To Dust, I certainly recommend it. The interesting thing about the next film in its relationship to Dust is they both star the same actor. Geza Rohrig is a Hungarian poet who was cast in Son of Saul after not having acted since the 1980s. So he had been out of acting for a very long time. And I think that Son of Saul, which we showed at the film festival, is the most original Holocaust film I've ever seen. And I've seen hundreds of them. I make sort of a habit of seeing every Holocaust film that comes out, and they're all gripping. And there are some other ones that should be mentioned. Europa, that Agnieszka Holland made many years ago, and her more recent one, In Darkness. are absolutely highly original, and there are lots of really excellent Holocaust films. But Son of Saul is really to be commended and really to be watched. It's again a first feature. It's a young Hungarian Jewish filmmaker. It's set in Auschwitz. It's a Sonderkommando who finds the body of his own son and goes to lengths to, again, it's about sort of, burial and end of life. It won the best. They wanted it to play at the Berlin Film Festival, and Berlin wouldn't put it in competition. They put it in the panorama. So they said, well, forget it. So they took it to Cannes in competition. It won the Grand Prix at Cannes. It went on to win the Best Foreign Film Oscar. It won the Golden Globe for Best Foreign Film. It's just a string of festival awards, and made Geza-Rohrig, very popular. And then he went on to star in To Dust with Matthew Broderick. So another really good reason to see both of these films is his performance, because it's beyond acting. There's something about Geza-Rohrig that he doesn't seem to be acting, but he seems, is a compelling performance as I've ever seen. Even Claude Lanzmann liked Son of Saul, and Claude Lanzmann doesn't like anything, and he called it very new, original, very unusual. And it did something in terms of the visuals that was very stunning, which is it created a completely shallow focus, narrow field of vision. The camera stayed kind of on Geza-Rohrig's shoulder the whole time. So you never really saw all the atrocity around you. Was a blur in the background, and everything was that intense focus on him and his tortured experience. So that made it an incredible visual experience. And I think that the director is to be commended, because he said his film was compared to the other film about Sonderkommandos that I just mentioned, is The Gray Zone, which is an excellent film. Tim Blake Nelson directed The Gray Zone. If you haven't seen it, it's a really good story about the Sonderkommando uprising at Auschwitz. And it's required viewing. But when his film, Son of Saul, was compared, he said, well, the director said, no, actually mine is the anti-Gray Zone. And what he really meant, which is true, is that almost all Holocaust films have to give viewers some sense of hope. If you think of Schindler's List, if you think of, so many films, there are rescuers, there's hope, there's some character you can identify with, there's something uplifting, there's something that, makes it, bearable. And he said the central reality of the Holocaust was death, and that you can't escape it. And he didn't feel it was morally responsible to make a movie that didn't depict that. There is nothing here other than death. And the honesty of that, and the immersive experience that he puts you in to tell that story, I just found one of the most incredible cinematic experiences I've ever had. And I don't know about you, but I go to the movies to have an experience. I don't go always just to be entertained or to be enlightened. I often really want to feel like I've had an experience, and Son of Saul really does that. A third film I want to recommend to you that was in the film festival is Wild Tales. We had this as closing night 4 years ago, I think. It's an Argentinian film, and also first-time film director, young Jewish Argentinian film director. He happens to have created the most popular TV show in Argentina, which of course I've never heard of, but he's a hot young director, and he came up with this compendium of short films. I think it's also 6 films, like the Coen brothers. And the short film is such a wonderful format, and we get to see it so rarely. To have 6 incredible short films one after another that are united by theme and yet all very different. It was an amazing accomplishment. I saw this film be described as insanely entertaining, and I would totally agree with it. It is dark, but it is very funny. It is not Son of Saul dark. It is dark comedy. It is black comedy, and its director is really to be commended for treading some of the same water, I would say, that Quentin Tarantino treads, which is revenge, anger, violence, the capabilities of human beings on the edge to go to the extreme. But he has a terrific sense of humor. And the last of the short films has a more explicit Jewish theme, but I think, I included it in a film festival, even though it's sort of a marginally Jewish in terms of its content, but I felt that it was so creative, and that the director, being Jewish, infused it with a great deal of kind of, again, subversion, anarchy. There's sort of a real sense of rebellion, of chutzpah, of challenging authority that goes on in a film like this that I think has a Jewish component to it. The other films I'm going to turn to were not in the film festival. For some reason, I would say one of my favorite Jewish films of all time is Everything is Illuminated. How many people have seen Everything is Illuminated? Well, if you haven't, you really owe it to yourself, because it is a beautiful film. It is beautiful. It's not dark. It's very quirky. It's very eccentric. I think the scene in which Jonathan Safran Foer, who wrote this was his first book, his first novel, and then it was adapted for the screen by Liev Schreiber. And Liev Schreiber is also, his grandfather was a Holocaust survivor who he sort of was raised by. And after his grandfather died, he felt very committed to kind of telling his story. And he had gone to the Ukraine, and he was sort of trying to work on his own project about going back to the Ukraine when the novel came to his attention, because he was given an early proof to, it's one of those things. He came across the story very early. He realized it was the same story he really wanted to tell. And so he wound up making the film, casting Elijah Wood as Jonathan Safran Foer. And this is a very autobiographical story, and one of the few books that's better, the movie is better than the book. That doesn't happen often. I read it. I don't think it's a great book, but it's interesting. But the movie is really, really terrific. Partly because of the casting. Elijah Wood, who plays the character of Jonathan Safran Foer, there are two stories going on simultaneously. There's a trip back to the Ukraine to try to figure out what happened to the grandfather and the woman who saved him during a huge an action against this Trochenbord, this town where all the Jews were killed, partly by the Germans and partly by Poles and the Ukrainians. So it was kind of a story that was rooted in reality and in Jonathan Safran Foer's own reality of trying to discover what happened. But it operates absolutely in the realm of fantasy. It is so vividly imagined that it takes place somewhere that isn't quite the real world that we know. The sunflower scenes alone, I stay in my mind to this day. And the casting of the lead singer from Gogol Bordello, Eugene Hutz, who is speaks Ukrainian. He's works out of New York, but he is Ukrainian, and so all the actors spoke the real language. The character of Alex was hilarious and brilliant, and the performance by Gene Hutz was terrific. The seeing eye bitches, which was the seeing eye dog, Sammy Davis Jr. Really just incredibly inventive use of characters and setting and story. And one of the things that I was listening to was Liev Schreiber doing an interview at a film festival about the film. And one of the things he discovered that he really loved about the story and the characters was what he called the ridiculous sense of humor, the kind of neurotic character that Jonathan Safran Foer has created that seemed to him so completely Jewish and so completely in line with everything that he connected with. And he had had a personal connection to the music. He'd been collecting Eastern European music and gypsy music, you know, his whole life. And he was able to use some of his own personal collection in the movie, Everything's Illuminated. So it really was a very personal thing, and I think that showed. I think Liev Schreiber really responded to the material. I think the material was very vividly imagined by a first-time novelist, a Jewish novelist, and then it was also Liev Schreiber's first time writing and because he wrote the screenplay. It was the first time writing and directing. So again, I think everything really came together for that to have a full expression of its originality. And if you haven't seen it, it's one of the most touching endings of any film I've ever seen. It's really profound and beautiful and fun, and it's really everything I want in a movie. So that's really why it's one of my favorite films, and certainly one of the most original. I'm going to switch to another movie that's quite recent, mostly because I want to urge you to see it. It isn't one of the 10 best movies of all time by any means, but it's really worth seeing, and people haven't seen it, and it's Death of Stalin. Anybody seen Death of Stalin? Okay, a couple of people. Oh, good, Trace. Yeah. I don't even think Paul's seen it. Death of Stalin, if for no other reason, it's banned in Russia. So don't you want to go see it? I mean, it's banned. It is quite accurate. There are some historical details that are inaccurate in terms of so-and-so really wasn't in office in this year, but the next year he was. So there was a little mishmash of historical fact, but the thrust of it is absolutely real. And it's about the death of Stalin, and it has an all-star cast. Steve Buscemi plays Khrushchev. Oh my God, what brilliant casting. You know, skinny little Steve Buscemi as Khrushchev. It's really Jeffrey Tambor, who is now you know, got caught in the Me Too movement and is now no longer kosher, I guess. Is also brilliant in it. And Michael Palin. I mean, it's a terrific, very dark look at communism. And if you think that the death of Stalin is a subject for a comedy, you know, again, this takes real originality. You get audiences to see something through a very different lens when you treat it with humor, and to see these guys, all the leaders of the Soviet Union standing around Stalin's body, arguing about what to do and bemoaning the fact that they can't really get a doctor because all the doctors have been killed in the doctor's plot of 52, and all the Jewish doctors are gone. So what are they going to do? And in fact, they did have to bring in some very young and some very old doctors because they weren't familiar with treating him. They were what was left over after the purges of the doctors. So it's full of that kind of, and it's a hilarious moment. Get a doctor. What do you mean we killed him? You know, like it's really very, very, very much worth seeing. And what's interesting also about Stalin, you know, there's a scene early on where he dies after watching a Western. And in fact, I didn't know this. Stalin was a huge John Wayne fan. He loved American. He had a screening room. He loved American movies, and John Wayne Westerns were his favorites. So who knew? That's Stalin. So I highly recommend it. Footnote, we didn't show during the film festival. I can't remember why, but I did discuss it a number of times. And Footnote is an Israeli film that I think is one of the most cleverly plotted films. It's not visually imaginative. It isn't really out of the norm. There was just something about the way the story was treated that was incredibly powerful. And Joseph Cedar is a wonderful Israeli director. He did Beaufort, which he won an Oscar for. Norman, the Fixer thing with God, I'm going to forget his name. Um, it'll come back to me. And Our Boys, which is a TV show, an Israeli TV show that's been on. So Joseph Cedar, he's modern Orthodox in Israel. He's a wonderful director. And Footnote has Lior Ashkenazi, who is probably the biggest Israeli star right now, you know, for the last 20 years. And it is really a brilliant father-son movie that's about a lot of very profound issues. And of the Israeli films, I really felt like it was worthy of being an original kind of story. But the other Israeli film that I wanted to mention in my list is Ushpizin. And Ushpizin is a lovely, delightful film that you haven't seen before because it was really the first film made by Orthodox Israelis in a way that was acceptable to the makers. And what I mean by that is Shuli Rand had been a very popular Israeli actor. He became Orthodox and stopped acting. He was approached with this script of Ushpizin and really wanted to play it, but one of the proscriptions was he couldn't act with a woman and look her in the eye and behave in an intimate way with the actress who was supposed to play his wife in the story. That wasn't going to be kosher. He convinced his own wife to play his wife, so they got around it that way, and she's actually wonderful. And it has a kind of sensitivity and genuine juiciness that you know comes from a kind of authenticity that at that time it really wasn't done. Now we've had quite a few films set in the Orthodox world that are much more authentic. Menashe we showed a few years ago. And the two films that I really love and that I'll be talking about next week more, Fill the Void and The Wedding Plan by Rama Burstein, who is the first female Orthodox woman to be a director of films. And so we're starting to see the Orthodox world from within, made by people in the community, not by people outside the community. It's not like when Sidney Lumet, who I love, directed an awful movie called Price Above Rubies, and it starred Melanie Griffith, who might as well have the word shiksa on her forehead, playing a cop who goes undercover in the Hasidic community, posing as a Hasidic woman. I mean, like, that was sort of so insulting to Orthodoxy to have that kind of Hollywood, take on it. So it's really worth mentioning. When I said before, what makes something original is the perspective. To have the insider perspective, to have it really be told by the people who understand it, who have a passion for it, who are of that world. Very often with original work, you find that it comes from a very personal place. It's a personal story that someone really, needs to tell. The last couple of films that I want to mention are two that were playing in the theaters when we still had theaters playing movies, and that's Jojo Rabbit and Uncut Gems. And Jojo Rabbit really was one of my favorite movies of this past year. And I talked to a lot of people who said, oh, I was so uncomfortable and I didn't like hearing all the anti-Semitic stuff. And, and I was so surprised because I found it so incredibly funny and so smart and unusual. And I think Taika Waititi is my favorite, Jewish director of the moment. Has anyone seen the vampire movie, What We Do in the Shadows? Anyone see? Oh, Sergio, yeah, you're my man. Oh, the Seltzers. Okay, What We Do in the Shadows. is a parody of a vampire movie that is one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my entire life. It's very campy. It's very, very, very campy, but it is hilarious. And Taika Waititi, whose father is Maori and whose mother is Jewish, has a completely unique sensibility. He is a comedian and has done a lot of comedy, so that's his bias, but he tackled a very serious subject, and I found Jojo Rabbit to be really quite brilliant, and I've seen it, I saw it a second time because I really wanted to, I had, my jaw was hanging open so much that at the end I felt, I had to close my jaw. So sometimes I feel like I need a second viewing when that happens, because I'm so like, I really can't believe this, but I really found it brilliant. And anyone who feels like all the anti-Semitism that is expressed is anything other than made laughable, and the delusions of what a 10-year-old boy, how he might be deluded into being part of the Hitler Youth, is really what the story is about. And I'm very sort of surprised that many people that I talked to didn't enjoy it, but I loved it. And Uncut Gems, I'm much more sympathetic to people who didn't like it, because it's a tough watch. It is so jittery, it's so on edge. But the Safdie brothers, who are young Iraqi Jews, their father was in the diamond business, and they knew this world very well. So they created a story that's very edgy. There's constant talk. I mean, Robert Altman must have loved the idea that somebody would have overlapping dialogue all the time. People are always talking. It's really very, very brilliant. And Adam Sandler cast so much against his comic type, and yet is sort of so appealing in a role of a guy who has, very little appeal as a character, and yet the casting was really quite brilliant. And I felt like this one was Uncut Gems was really worth seeing. But it will, it makes you nervous. It's a very anxiety provoking experience. But again, a submersive experience. You really feel like you've been through the ringer when you come out. You really feel like you've had a really intense experience. That's not what everybody, goes to the movies for, but it is certainly something that I do. So I wanted to leave a couple of minutes to get some comments from people. So if you want to comment on any of the movies we've discussed, in particular Jojo Rabbit or Uncut Gems, now is your time. Raise your hand and Nancy will unmute you, and let's hear what you have to say. Who would like to say something? Wave to me if you're, yeah, Howard. Howard Leibowitz is going to say something. But first he has to get unmuted. I can't unmute you. Only Nancy can unmute you. Hold on.
How about now?
You're on.
Okay. So Uncut Gems I thought was pretty extraordinary. The ending wasn't realistic. Literally the end, which I'm not going to talk about. But it was amazing, and I couldn't believe Adam Sandler's acting ability in that. I just looking at I've seen almost, I think the only movie I haven't seen amongst all your things was Gray Zone, so I'm looking forward to seeing that. Jojo Rabbit, okay, so I'm not quite in your camp on that. I guess I'm in the Son of Saul Holocaust camp. I mean, it was a terrible time, and that was very realistic. I thought the movie was really well done, but that's not how I look at the Holocaust. Kind of a Wes Anderson meets Hogan hero thing, not quite for me. But I think it's definitely worth seeing, and I'd recommend it. And I love a lot of your other things also here. So
thank you.
Yeah, great.
Great. Who else?
Kathryn, before I call on Elizabeth, Sergio had a lot of other suggestions of things that should be on your list.
Great.
I'm going to guess that the reason why they're not is because you really just chose movies from the last 20 years. He wanted to know how come Little Big Man wasn't on there, The Graduate, The Search, Raising Arizona, The Frisco Kid. So he had a lot of other recommendations that you might have considered to be original.
I would love to see those. We'll send them to everybody. I'd love to have, I did mention The Graduate back in the 60s films, and I mentioned all the Coen brothers films, but Raising Arizona does happen to be one of my personal favorites. You're absolutely right. Frisco Kid was a wonderful inversion of the comic inversion of the Western with a Jewish twist. So yeah, there are a lot more titles, but I try to limit myself to 10 and more recent ones. But yeah, I'd love to see your list, Sergio, so please share it with us. Okay, Elizabeth.
Hi.
I see your windows. There you are.
You're in my kitchen. I'm making dinner and listening to you. So
Okay.
It actually worked for me that you didn't have visuals because that would have distracted from the dinner making. But my question is this. What's your definition of a Jewish film? Is it the Jewish topic or the Jewish director or storyteller? Like, the people involved being Jewish or the subject matter?
That's a great question. And when I wrote my book, The 50 Greatest Jewish Movies, that's exactly what I had to address. And I'm happy to send you my longer version of what I wrote because I thought about it. But I will briefly, answer that question. In my mind, simply the fact that someone is Jewish and makes a movie does not make it a Jewish movie. And there are, thousands of examples of that. Conversely, I think everyone would agree that Fiddler on the Roof was a pretty damn Jewish movie, even though the director, whose name is Norman Jewison, is a Methodist and not Jewish. So I'm not saying that the authorship is not important because sometimes, like I say, there's a sensibility that's very Jewish that comes from the authorship, but that is not the criteria in and of itself. There really has to be the subject matter or characters. If there's a main or strong Jewish character in the story, or the story itself, it deals with Jewish life or history or experience, or sometimes a movie has to deal with something that is of great interest to Jewish audiences, even though there's less involvement. So for instance, there was an Israeli film recently, the director actually is Lebanese, and The Attack, it's called The Attack, and it's about two Palestinians, husband and wife. He's a doctor, I think she's a doctor too, and she becomes a suicide bomber. And it's an incredible movie. I think Jewish audiences are naturally very interested in that. The main characters are Palestinians. So sometimes it's in the neighborhood, it's that, but mostly it has to do with the story, has something to do with the Jewish experience, Jewish characters, Jewish life, Jewish history, and often the sensibility of the author plays into it as well. Does that answer your question, Elizabeth?
Thank you.
Okay. Who else has a question? Yeah, Lynn.
Bill
Lynn.
Nagdale, yes, hi. I thought Ushpizin was a wonderful film because of the fact it's three crooks, a reformed crook who has become more religious and two other crooks who visit him. And I thought that was a very unique story for a Jewish film, that they were all essentially crooks at one time, all served time in prison. And I thought that was very unique in a Jewish film.
It's a wonderful movie, yeah. Who else? Barbara Steinmetz' dog have anything to say? No?
Paul does. Paul Shankman, go ahead.
Hey, Paul.
Hi,
Hi, Paul.
I really like Jojo Rabbit
Oh, good.
and The Death of Stalin, both because they were absurd but had a point to make. The one Holocaust film that I would mention in the same breath as Son of Saul is Fateless, which came out in 2006, follows a Jewish teenager through the Holocaust. The cinematography is just stunning.
It is. And it is probably as bleak and unrelenting as any Holocaust film. But I did find, in terms of originality, the way Son of Saul was filmed created an immersive experience. But yes, the Jerzy Kosinski, you know, kind of visuals and Fateless was wonderful. It was really terrific. So thanks for adding that one. Anybody else have other films they were hoping I'd mention, or they really blew them away, or really they felt like, I have not seen this movie before? And any other recommendations?
What about Pi?
What?
Pi?
Pi?
Yeah.
Life of Pi?
No,
Oh,
Pi.
Oh, yes. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness, yes. Darren Aronofsky. That is oh yeah. How many people have seen Pi? A few. Okay, yeah, a few Pi. That's like almost David Lynch kind of weird. You know, when you first said, I was thinking of Life of Pi, the tiger on the boat thing, which is also incredibly, you know, creative. But Pi, Darren Aronofsky, and then his next one, Requiem of a Dream. Also brilliant, and yes, absolutely an auteur, completely creative, something, you know, jaw-dropping, you know, something in Requiem for a Dream, the drugs, when he takes the drugs, I have never seen a visual expression of what that high is. And the way he does that visually is unbelievable. And that's really what the filmmaker is trying to do, is show you, give you experiences that you might be able to get in reading about it or through your own imagination, but it has to be, the filmmaker has to imagine for you in some way. And so when they move out of the constraints of reality into more absurdism and more stylization, and leave some of the constraints of, yes, this is how things would really work in the real world, very often they enter kind of this magical realm of metaphor that we totally understand, even though we know this isn't how our life would play out, you know, around the block. But we go there with the filmmaker. Any other? Yeah, Lynn?
This may not be highly original, but it's delightful. The Hallmark movie, Loving Leah. Have you seen that?
No.
Predictably, you know, happy ending like a Hallmark movie, but it's authentic and it's very sweet. A woman's Orthodox husband dies, and she meets the brother of the husband because of the tradition of the Levirate marriage. And she ends up with the unorthodox brother. And it's just a very sweet, happy movie.
All right, thanks for the recommendation. I'll be happy to take a look. Thanks for.
Kathryn, we've got one more. Elizabeth Bearcat raised her hand again.
So you don't get Elizabeth, this time you get me. Since I heard you talk earlier about Woody Allen, I often go towards Mel Brooks. And one of the films that would be quite controversial to add here, but I felt it was quite Jewish even when I was 13 when I first saw it, would have been History of the World Part 1, of all things. So I'm not sure how many people go back to that when I see a few smiles. But it comes in 5 chapters. 3 of them are directly Jewish related, okay? You have Moses receiving the 10 commandments. You have the entire middle part, which is the Roman Empire, which basically tells the story of a Jewish comedian making his way to Israel with his famous agent, Swiftest Lazarus. Just love that. And then the third part that comes in, of course, is the unfortunate bit that was controversial around the Spanish Inquisition, which is a whole song and dance number. So not only is the humor Jewish, but you're actually getting different types of genres of films that a Jewish filmmaker would make, plus, you know, Mel Brooks. So when we were discussing around the table last night what films might be discussed today, and we hit the nose on a few of them, we missed many others that we're going to look into. That was one I threw in there, and I don't think I annoyed anyone around the table when I said it, so I thought I would just share that here.
I think Mel Brooks is absolutely brilliant, and yes, the producers was original. I should have really mentioned that before Jojo Rabbit, that Jojo Rabbit really owes to the producers and to the great dictator, Charlie Chaplin. They really owes a lot to those two films. And for Mel Brooks to have made, Springtime for Hitler in Germany, you want to talk about chutzpah, I would give him the award, hands down. And I think I always like to say my favorite expression of the Jewish experience comes from a Mel Brooks song from the 12 Chairs, and the line is this: hope for the best, expect the worst. Is that the Jewish experience in a nutshell? So that's the song, hope for the best, expect the worst. And that's that. So yes, Mel Brooks is right up there with Woody Allen, and certainly completely original and ultimately Jewish. There's a wonderful thing I just watched called How to Be a Jewish Son. And I'm watching it because of the Mother's Day thing next week. David Susskind had a TV show in the 70s, I think, and they brought on a bunch of Jewish guys to talk about how to be a Jewish son. And so it was Mel Brooks stole the show, of course, but it was also David Steinberg, who was brilliant and young in this, and the guy who wound up marrying anyway, there are a number of really interesting people, and it's very funny from the 70s. And Mel Brooks certainly continued to be a huge influence, and we wouldn't have Curb Your Enthusiasm without Mel Brooks. I mean, I think there's a lot of tribute to be laid at his feet. So I'm glad you mentioned him, because certainly in terms of humor and unapologetically Jewish humor, Mel Brooks is, right up there with Woody Allen.
Perfect segue